Welcome to the stream. I'm Femi OK. The global climate emergency is unfolding fast and it's taking a toll on some people's mental health. As we start an entire week of shows tied to the Covering Climate Now initiative, today we look at a condition known as climate grief. What are the symptoms? Stay with us to find out. Seems like every day brings headlines about catastrophic events tied to climate change, whether it is storms, Arctic ice melt or rising sea levels. And the impact of climate change is a challenge for mental health professionals who are now seeing patients with a whole range of illnesses. People in communities directly affected by ecological changes are at risk of post-traumatic stress and depression. But even those whose lives have not yet been profoundly altered by climate change events may feel deeply anxious about the future for humankind. For more, we are joined from the Costa Rican capital, San Jose, by Cristiana Figueres. She is founder of Global Optimism, a movement dedicated to environmental change. She was the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ashley Consolo is director at the Labrador Institute of Memorial University and has researched climate change impacts on the health of Indigenous communities. She's in Sydney, in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. And for the Fijian capital of Suva, we're joined by Joseph Zain-Sikulu. He's a Pacific organizer at 350.org. That's a broad-based environmental movement. Hello, climate warriors. It is so good to have you here on the stream. Let me start with some young people that we met at the climate strike in Washington, D.C. last Friday. And that is when the young climate activist Greta Thunberg was in front of the White House. And we spoke to young people about their levels of climate anxiety. This is what they told us.
I think a lot of what climate change anxiety is for me exists in what Greta stands for. The idea of we don't have a future, so why am I going to school if there's nothing to prepare for?
The thing I'm most scared about is when I have kids or when they have kids, what is their world going to look like? Because my world is pretty nice. I like how it is, but obviously it has to change, and I just want my kids to have a nice world as well.
I do tend to try to think of things humorously. So when we're talking about climate change, I tell myself, oh, I won't have to worry about this because, we won't survive climate change anyway, and we start laughing. But the root of it is so terrifying that right after I make that remark, I start to realize it all over again.
Christiana, guess this idea of being terrified by our potential future. Christiana, you go first. What would you even say to those young people?
Well, those young people, Femi, and thank you for having all three of us on today, those young people are actually speaking what I have been feeling for decades. I've worked on climate change for over 30 years, believe it or not, and I've been known to be such a crybaby about this. I have been known to cry in public, in front of the cameras, in front of microphones, because this really is incredibly sad. The injustice that is being done here from generation to generation has absolutely no words. It is unbelievable what my generation is doing to the next generation. Now, it is very important to realize two things on this. First, we are all incredibly grateful that the young people are on the streets. But my generation cannot put the responsibility of at least beginning to change the course of what we're doing here on emissions. That is our responsibility. That is not the responsibility of young people. We need to do that, and the young people will have to finish the job. But that is not a responsibility. I really get very irate when I hear people my age say, oh, thank God the young people are going to save us. No, that is our responsibility, not to be put on the shoulders of young people. And the second is I very much honor and I share and have shared for decades, way before these kids were born, the grief around climate change, and we cannot afford to be paralyzed by that grief and by that despair. We have to move, honor that grief, honor the despair, get into mourning, and use the energy of that anger and that sadness to transform the world that we are going to create, that we have to create. We cannot stay in the hole. We have to peek out of the hole and make sure that we transform.
Right. Joe, where were you in that hole? Because there'll be some people who'll be listening to this program and they won't quite understand this idea of climate grief, climate anxiety, but you live in the part of the world where climate change is happening to you as we speak. Can you explain that for us?
Climate grief and anxiety is something that we know all too well in the Pacific, and we also know that in grieving and in mourning we can start the healing process, and that's something we've always advocated for. And loss is such a big thing when you think about dispossession of your land and losing everything that we are connected to, and our young people feel this very much. And when you add to that conversations of the climate crisis and how the Pacific has contributed practically nothing to the causes of this, that disproportion in itself that you face, and then when we're faced with the harshness of the effects, really has a big impact on the way our young people are. But we know and we empower them to understand that through mourning we can begin the healing process, and through taking action like these climate strikes that are happening this weekend, they can stand up for themselves and feel like they are doing something to contribute to the changes that we need to see, especially here in the Pacific.
Sure. Joe, for those who are not familiar with the changes in the Pacific, do you want to just be a little bit more detailed about what you're talking about? What is the loss? What is the grief?
I think the biggest and most visible thing is the rising sea levels. And maybe the best way to highlight this is over the last couple of weeks, there have been students organising across the world for the climate strikes, which are happening this weekend. In Kiribati a couple of weeks ago, one of the highest king tides was scheduled to be hitting the island, and whilst all the kids across the world were preparing for the climate strike, the kids in Kiribati were rebuilding their seawalls higher, because this king tide came in at about 3 meters high when the island itself is no higher than 2.9 feet, like meters above sea level.
So when you talk about the grief there, it's basically their home disappearing underneath the rising sea level, so they are losing their home. I want to share this with you. This is from Rob Lowe, and Rob Lowe is an environmentalist. He works on the environment, and when we asked him about the idea of grieving and climate anxiety, because they're kind of new terms, although Christiana says she's been experiencing it for a very long time. She's ahead of most of us. Rob says, of course, it's impossible to be aware of the climate crisis and not experience grief and anxiety. Ashley, can you explain some of the symptoms? Because I think sometimes people are experiencing these symptoms and have no idea that they are doing so.
Yes, so climate anxiety and climate grief are something that we're learning more and more about. The research is burgeoning, it's expanding. We're starting to hear from people all over the world who are either at the front lines of a changing climate, like we're hearing from Joseph, people who are experiencing slower changes, people who have experienced an acute thing like a hurricane or a wildfire. And essentially what it is a form of anxiety or mental health response that is related to a change in the environment or the ecosystem in which you're in. And the anxiety can take all different forms, including grief and loss and mourning. And certainly that's something that we're hearing about a lot, is the ways in which people are feeling pain and suffering at watching their homelands change, at watching biodiversity switch, and watching just cultural continuity change for people who are deeply connected to the environment.
Actually, you worked on a survey called the Greenlandic Perspectives on Climate Change. So you were looking into areas of the world where climate change is actually happening. What is that doing to the local population? What is that doing to their livelihood? So when they're depending on a frigid environment and that environment is warming and warming and warming, what happens to those people? Have a look.
Yeah, so I actually worked directly on the climate change.
Taksi okiingallaan maanakkit 70-sinnilarpa innaqqatigi taamaallun takisinnarup ikiliarternernunaqqati imma ernimaamuttarpun immaqa pissutigalu tas maligiserapar maanik silaana аллангуартутtu kiannerilерп иммақалин анерлериуннерилерлани имма тас имаасиннаа мааннунаққатигин суннитеқаруссуарт пиниартунгуллу аасартунгуллу.
Actually, you didn't work on that project, but you are very familiar with that, and you can even hear the voice of how down. It just sounds depressed. As you can see that people have left. People aren't there anymore. Climate change is causing climate migration as well.
Yeah, and it certainly ties into work I've been doing with Inuit in Northern Labrador for the past 12 years. And we're seeing resonance all across the North in terms of people just feeling that pain as their homelands change, as sea ice shifts, as plants and animals change, as ability to feed your family alters, and as people are responding to generations of connection to land, and that land is changing, this pain that people feel is very large and very real. And what we argue is that it's actually a very normal response to what we're seeing in climate change.
Christiana, you talked about the hole and peeking out of the hole. I want to do that via my laptop here. Global Optimism, which is the organization that you work with. Outrage plus optimism. So we've heard, really built up a really good case for why people should be grieving and why they have anxiety. And then you want to turn that on its head and use that anxiety to actually help people take action. What's one of the most useful tools that you use?
In the decades that I've been working on climate change, I have never seen as much outrage as there is now. And that is a very good thing. Because what we continue to do, we haven't even started to begin to reduce emissions. We haven't even started. We're still increasing emissions, despite the fact that science is incontrovertible, despite the fact that we have so much pain, so much loss, so much destruction. We haven't even started the descent of emissions. So of course there's outrage, and that is a very good thing that we have that outrage. But as I said before, we have to be able to balance that with tenaciousness, with the ingrained and a very deep conviction that we can transform this. It is going to be, sadly, too late for some people, but it doesn't have to be too late for everyone. We have to be able to turn this around. Now, what is interesting is when you think about natural disasters, local natural disasters, let's think about a hurricane, let's think about a cyclone, even a terrorist attack. Those are disasters that happen in specific localities. And our human reaction to that is usually one of solidarity, because those that are most affected need the help and the support from those that have not been as affected. And you see people in these situations, in these emergency situations, coming around in circles of love and support and sharing food and helping to dig each other's belongings out, even dig each other out. That is the kind of human solidarity, love reaction that we need across the globe, not just for an acute emergency in one specific area, but for the planet. This is no longer an acute emergency, this is a chronic emergency.
Sure.
And we have to be able to dig in and bring out the solidarity that we do once in a while. It is going to have to be the sentiment that is actually predominant on this planet.
Joe, let me show you this. This is Gabriella, and she says on Twitter, in climate change education initiatives, we are experiencing a shift in the narrative and many initiatives to concentrate not only on providing knowledge about climate change or foster climate action and behavioural change, but also fostering positive emotions such as hope and joy. Are you there yet? What are you using as a tool and to strategise?
I think this is something that's always been central to our work as Pacific climate warriors. And that comes from the main reasoning that the narrative around the Pacific and this climate crisis has always been that we are victims of climate change. And that can bring a lot of anxiety and depression to our people. So one thing we've always worked very hard to do is to shift that narrative. And our mantra is, we are not drowning, we are fighting, because we want to rise and we want to empower from within our people to know that we can take action in these spaces. And a lot of our work is rooted definitely in our culture and in our understanding in our Indigenous culture. And we know that the answers to the climate crisis and the answers to what we need to build a more resilient community, we can find already within our culture. And I think that's what we need to be doing within this community. And there's definitely something in there about this solidarity, and this big global climate action that's happening this week speaks to that. A lot of people might question the things that are happening at the moment, but to see the world standing in solidarity for this moment around climate change and building that community of solidarity is exactly what we need to be doing right now in order to make the changes in this world.
Ashley, as we're chatting, we're getting feedback in from viewers. Gene Torres, I'm just looking at who he is. He's a father of two, loving husband, friend by many, US Navy veteran and a proud Filipino. This is what he says. Parents like myself are seriously affected by the impacts of climate change felt around the world, not knowing if our children will still have a world to enjoy. How would you counsel Gene?
Well, I think Gene is not alone. I think many of us, including myself, who are raising young children right now, are worried about what it means. But I also think if you go back to what Christiana and Joseph were talking about, we can't give in to despair. So we have to talk to our kids and our children and our youth about how these feelings are normal and how they can move forward in a way that's positive and support and solidarity. And one thing that I always say to people when they ask about how do we deal with this pain, how do we deal with the suffering, is it's actually a privilege and an honor to grieve something, because we only grieve what we love and we only grieve what we lose that's important to us. So if we are grieving, it means it's a privilege and an honor that we have to respond to. And that's the same with teaching our children how to grieve. It's teaching them how to not hide from it or become debilitated by it. It's starting those positive, productive conversations that are focused on that global solidarity and also the local and regional solidarity, so we have those support networks for ourselves, for youth, for all generations.
Christiana, I understand that you have to be diplomatic because you need to get everybody on board here. You can't afford to point fingers. But I'm wondering, are we as a world and as communities grieving, but the politicians are not?
Well, I think even that is changing. And into that question, I would put politicians and CEOs of large corporations or of financial institutions, all of those that are making the big mega decisions that are really determining the course of the global economy. And I think those leaders, thought leaders and decision makers are beginning to be touched. They're beginning to be touched first by their own children. I cannot tell you how many people at those levels have come to me recently in the past 2-3 months to say, my 16-year-old daughter or my 11-year-old son told me that I need to be more responsible. They want to be proud of their father or of their mother. Yeah. So they're beginning to be touched by their children, which is a very good thing. But they are also beginning to be touched by the outrage on the streets. The masses of people, and we're going to be having massive strikes on Friday, on the 20th, and on the 27th, and everybody should join those strikes wherever you are because they will be global. And that social intolerance, that license to operate that is now being removed from my generation, is one that is moving these people to make the right decisions. The question, so we're moving in the right direction. Yeah. The question for me is speed. Are we doing this at the speed that we need? And sadly, the answer to that question is no.
Joe, I have to give this one to you. This is from Izzy Anderson, again, coming live as they're watching you. Izzy Anderson says, until climate change really affects those in the developed world, nothing will be done. Joe, be candid, be honest. Reaction to that?
I agree. Sometimes I definitely, within this region, our closest neighbours here are New Zealand and Australia. And one thing that we do find is that one thing that we do know working in this region is that if they were feeling the effects as much as we are, then they would be doing a bit more about it. Now in Australia, they are finding these bushfires that are becoming more ferocious and more common, and you see the action is starting to change. And I think it definitely is the case with a lot of the Western world, is that they don't have this understanding of what it is to live on the front lines of climate change. So that change is just, so we're just waiting for them to make these changes. But I definitely agree with that statement.
I want to share this with you. This is from a Guardian article that Rob Lowe wrote. It was like an opinion piece, Rob Lowe, and I showed you his tweet a little bit earlier on. The headline, I have felt hopelessness over climate change. Here is how we move past the immense grief. And then Rob suggests this to us. Work out how you can tackle climate change in your work. Every job is a climate job, potentially, if you're a dentist, an accountant, an engineer. Ashley, what is your takeaway? We're working through the grief, we're working through the anxiety. What can we do?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Rob. I mean, I think all of us are responsible in some way, and we all have to find the avenues in which we can support and make change, and we can advocate for this, and we can continue to bring the emotions into the climate discussion. It's not a technocratic discussion. It's not a science only. We have to unite the human impacts, the human emotions. So these are the opportunities where we have to come together and to start making that change at our local level, in our jobs, in our profession, but also in sharing our stories. And in telling the stories of being at the front lines or experiencing acute change or experiencing slow and cumulative change, of telling the stories of the places you love, the pain that you're feeling in those loss, and what we can do about it. It takes everyone. So I completely agree, no matter what we do or who we are, we all have to come together in this idea of global solidarity.
I guess I have a challenge for you. This is from Matala on Twitter. Providing more news on progress and covering more incredible climate action stories. Who wants to volunteer a positive climate action story for us? We talked about grief, anxiety. Who's going to bring the positive story?
Well, I can give you a little heads up without mentioning the names yet,
All right.
because
a little
it's quite confidential.
Maybe.
but we will have pretty amazing sized big scale corporations that will be announcing already this week, 1 week in advance of the climate summit, how they are already 100% renewable energy, how they are moving very fast to climate neutrality. We will have other corporations coming out saying, actually, the Paris Agreement requires everyone to be climate neutral by 2050. We're going to do it before that. We will have quite an impressive group of financial institutions that are coming out saying, we totally understand the science and we want to align with the science, and we're going to be aligning our portfolio with the 1.5 degree warming as being the maximum warming, i.e. putting a huge amount of pressure on themselves to perform, because they understand, frankly, that yes, this is the common good, but it's also in their own interest. It's a national interest. It's in the interest of cities. It's in the interest of corporations. It's in the interest of financial institutions. And that's the bit, Femi, that I don't think we have done a good job explaining. We always come at this from the global need, the global responsibility, all of which is true. And I'm not undermining that at all, because otherwise I wouldn't have put 35 years of my life into it. But also, there is a huge opportunity here to have cities that are so much more livable, to have much better efficient transportation and less transportation, to have much better energy independence. The Pacific Islands are the best example. They are zero emitters. They do not emit anything. Most of them have already committed to moving over to 100% renewable energy. Now, that is an impressive role modeling exercise that these Pacific Islands are doing. Why? Because it's in their own good. Because otherwise they have to spend huge amounts of money importing the stupid fossil fuels, which by the time you get them down to the Pacific Islands are very expensive, not just because of the fuel, but because of the transport to get there. So it doesn't make any sense when these gorgeous islands have all of that solar energy and wind energy right over them. So just a small example of, we have to be able to turn this around and understand, yes, there's a responsibility. Yes, there's an emergency. Yes, there's crisis. Yes, there is all of that. Totally true. And at the same time, let us please wake up to this incredible opportunity, honestly.
Jo, your anxiety levels, your climate anxiety levels on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is your zen, 10 is what the hell?
Maybe it goes from 1 to 10 on a daily basis. It just changes.
Commiserations.
Every moment, depending on what's happening.
Of course.
I think it just goes from day to day. But there's definitely something in there that Christiana was talking about. And one of the things I do always focus on whenever I'm feeling anxious about the climate crisis or climate anxiety is the amazing work that's coming out of the Pacific and leading up into this big, massive globalization that's happening. Tokelau recently just added wind power. Before that, they were run 100% solar power,
Jo,
and they just added wind power.
Jo, through your anxiety, whether it's 1 or 10, you continue to smile. Thank you for bringing your perspective to us here on the stream. Thank you, Christiana. Thank you, Ashley, as well. Really appreciate you kicking off our very first episode on covering climate now. Now, on the next episode of the stream, we will look at an epic project that's planting a huge barrier of trees from the west to the east coast of Africa to actually hold back the Sahara Desert. It is an audacious idea. It is called the Great Green Wall, and it's the subject of a brand new documentary. Join us tomorrow as we continue our special series of conversations tied to the Covering Climate Now initiative. Until then, take care.